This is Yarovy Hun. I contribute to the Ukrainian Weekly newspaper. A week ago, there was a conference here, the Washington Group Leadership Conference, not held in the five-star hotel, I might add, somewhat less. But and the experts participating in the panel discussions, if not all, most recommended or suggested that the new administration start off by a number of reforms in the economic, energy, and judicial part of sector of Ukraine. Could you recommend one single reform that they should start off with right away?
The biggest challenge for Ukraine today is corruption. It is eating up, you may guess, some people are saying more than 50% of Ukrainian economy is in shadow. So if you are not addressing corruption, if there is no more transparency, corruption is directly linked to the very corrupted legal system. So if you cannot find justice, if you are an investor, you cannot find justice in the country. If normal Ukrainians believes that going to court is a bad joke, it's very difficult to talk about anything else. So I would start from this. Issues around corruption, legal reform, transparency of the decision, rest of the steps. I am very skeptical about Ukrainian way to fight corruption by creating anti-corruption bureau, because this would be most corrupted bureau in our realities. But in real sense, the biggest challenge is the fact that our system is very ineffective. Even if you get people eager to change something, they get into the system. Either you are part of the system or you are out of the system. I felt that personally. One of very smart American congressmen told me 10 years ago, if somebody is making successful career in the country totally corrupted, it means that you are part of that system, because if you don't fit in, you will be either out or you will become part of the corrupted system. Therefore, for many Ukrainians coming to Western capitals, businessmen, politicians, and talking about reforms, not answering corruption, I would be very, very skeptical, because it will finally lead to the same result.
Oleg, Nadia McConnell here. When you talk about corruption, or at least I guess if I would talk about corruption, I would take a very broad, I would make a very broad definition of it. And it leads me to the question that I want to ask you. And that has to do with following, first and foremost, the Constitution of Ukraine. I mean, to me, it's a fundamental, basic element of rule of law. And yet, some of the pronouncements that President-elect Yanukovych has announced, for instance, a possible extending the Black Sea Fleet arrangement, the whole issue of language, the canceling of the local elections, though it was not his action, I guess it was an action of the parliament, or deputies voting other members' cards, are violations of the Constitution. To me, that's sort of a fundamental issue that has to be addressed. What is your view about that?
Yeah, I would agree, but in Ukraine, violation of Constitution is not in news at all. And Constitution was ignored by grant of Constitution, President and his administration, by Prime Minister, by Parliament. Therefore, again, you have to do it. You are in the States, in the country where law is the law. In Ukraine, many civil experts are discussing what is the point of, let's say, upgrading or improving Constitution, making it more perfect, when politicians are happily ignoring those laws. And therefore, it's like a vicious circle. Law is actually ignored. We have politics, we got the worst case scenario when politicians have introduced quotas into Supreme Court, Constitutional Court. I mean, politicians, it's like President has his number of quota, then Parliament has, different parties have, and then it led to a situation where each side is blaming other. in political influence over courts. Therefore, we are coming back again to the same reform of legislation. Constitution is the highest law which politicians are blaming for being not too well thought of and controversial. But even if it is clearly defining obligations, still it is not respected. Therefore, it's also the issue of whom we are electing in Ukraine, and it's also the issue of public tolerance. My feeling is that public tolerance is now close to zero, that this kind of obvious cynical challenge and ignorance of law in my country, and law at large, not simply constitution, but the fact, for example, that very, very broadly discussed in Ukraine, the fact that you may kill a person and get rid of it without any responsibility if you are a member of parliament, or mostly it is happening with kids just driving $500,000 worth sport cars and killing people right in the street, and nobody got into prison. So this kind of open challenge and ignorance of law is really approaching very dangerous point, where sometimes people are talking about taking justice in their own hands. My feeling is that politicians understand that, but till that point where we are electing politicians who clearly ignore law, for example, by showing their declarations, it's both Yanukovych and Tymoshenko. They both have been publicly caught by providing not true information as candidates for presidency, showing their profits and their expenses, and still they're elected. So it's something we have to do within the society, and probably we are concentrating on that mostly in our day-to-day activity.
Well, if there are no further questions from our gathered group here, I have one more. President Yushchenko announced, I believe, that he will not attend the inaugural ceremony for the newly elected president. Is that still the case? And what is your view about this?
Well, I've been talking this morning at that conference. I was talking to the shadow Minister of Foreign Affairs, Leonid Kozhara, who was actually working, I guess, 10-15 years. He was in U.S. Embassy as one of the diplomats, so some of you might know him. He told me that in protocol, and he showed me the protocol of tomorrow's, the day after tomorrow's inauguration, there were names of 3 presidents, Kuchma, Kravchuk, and Yushchenko. And he told me, frankly, that they are working with President Yushchenko to convince him to come. Kravchuk made a couple of President Kravchuk made a couple of statements that he is not going to come, and he repeated it today. I just saw it in the news a few hours ago. But we don't have, first of all, we don't have that formal tradition. Tradition is not there. When Yushchenko was sworn as the president, President Kuchma and President Kravchuk had been there in parliament. This time, Viktor Yushchenko said that he is tired, he will not attend. But the same President Kravchuk is emphasizing that the participation of President Yushchenko is practically a must, because this is the outgoing president sharing ceremony with newly elected president. It's very, very proper, very proper ceremony. I would remember myself how many times Viktor Yushchenko was saying about President Kuchma that whatever he might be critical of President Kuchma as an individual, he was always saying that Ukrainians must remember about the importance and dignity and respect to the presidency. I personally believe that if the day after tomorrow, at formal inauguration, which will be widely broadcasted throughout the nation, which will be visited by a number of foreign dignitaries, President Yushchenko would not be present, he is doing very bad favor for himself and for his career and for his reputation, as well as, by the way, Prime Minister Tymoshenko, who still refuse to recognize the victory or her own defeat as the candidate, and who refuse to recognize newly elected President Yanukovych, despite all international observers, despite legal cases. And this is absolutely absurd when the Prime Minister, she is Prime Minister, refuses to recognize the legacy of newly elected President, when the whole world, including Ukrainian legal court's decision, have admitted that elections have been free and fair. So we have a lot for our politicians to learn about. They so happily speak about European tradition, about European choice, about Western politics, Western culture, but when it comes to their personal egos, despite standard phrase that forget about personal, think about country, in reality it happens vice versa. They are forgetting about countries and they are contemplating their egos, unfortunately.
Well, Olive, I wish you'd be a little bit more candid.